but Vera's earlier culinary intentions slipped away. She muttered a curse. The entire riverbank was littered with swirling purple knots. Either the local mud crabs were experimenting with a restricted mineral diet, or something was very seriously wrong with her. Vera rubbed her eyes, but the visual distortion remained. She folded herself into a cross-legged position, bringing the bow to her lap. A titch strong, the Dunmer had warned her when she had asked him to share his smoking mixture. What the hell had she been thinking, making that stupid request in the first place? Idiot. More importantly, was the effect something specific to mud crabs, or was it more general? She glanced dubiously at her own hands. They seemed perfectly normal. No eerie glow. Hopefully, whatever chemical was causing the light show, it wasn't permanent. She would bring the roll up to Bothala and see if the old woman could reverse engineer the ingredients. Vera turned her gaze back to the chittering critters below. Something had drawn the little bastards to a spot at the edge of a shallow pool where the current slowed and swirled. An old rowboat had been dragged partway onto the beach, but the mud crabs didn't seem interested in that. They were all clustering a few feet away, around a dark shape bobbing in the water. Mud crabs were, by and large, opportunistic scavengers, which meant that the shape was most likely a dead body. Vera straightened, fished out an arrow from the quiver at her hip, and drew her bow, aiming at the largest creature. She released the arrow, the string ringing with a satisfying twang, and the mud crab shuddered, collapsed on its belly, and went still. Its buddies hissed and whistled, but didn't stop their meal. Shoo, you fuckers, I don't want your dinner. Just want the boat. She dispatched 2 more mud crabs before the rest of the throng abandoned their prey, launching themselves into the water or skittering along the gravel towards the shelter of the cliffs. Vera climbed down. The stench of decomposition, still faint but unmistakable, hit her nostrils once she was a few feet away from the boat. Vera glanced at the dead body, a bloated back covered in the reds and browns of imperial armor, swayed gently with the ebb and flow. She approached the dinghy. Several burlap sacks lay eviscerated at the bottom of the boat, their cargo of wheat and potatoes strewn over the weather-bleached planks, but the little vessel was otherwise dry on the inside. The mud crabs were beginning to coalesce into an irate militia some 20 paces away, so Vera planted her palms on the hull and shoved. Her feet weren't destined to stay dry, apparently. She waded through the shallows, teeth clenched against the bracingly cold water sipping into her boots. Another shove, and the dinghy wobbled, the current rotating the bow to face downriver. She tried the rudder, a creaky but function affair, and as the current yanked the skiff forward, she hoisted herself into it, inelegantly, her boots slipping on the damp wood. She narrowly avoided pitching forward and busting her nose on the planks, but then she righted herself and steered the craft along the shoreline to the site of their erstwhile camp. If shit hit the fan and Undnar's insane scheme brought a party of Forsorn down on her head, she'd have a quick means of escape. As long as she managed to beach the skiff before the rapids, and scat, Vera whiled away the remaining hours, cleaning out the dinghy and checking it for leaks, collecting river clams for her dinner, and attempting, unsuccessfully, to dry out her boots in the waning sunlight until the sun dipped behind the cliffs. She weighed the risks of a campfire against the allure of having dry toes and a cooked dinner. If the Forsworn hadn't showed up by now, perhaps they weren't going to bother at all. In the end, the promise of modest creature comforts prevailed, so she made a small driftwood fire in the shelter of the cliffs. An evening wind had picked up, scattering the narrow plume of smoke over the water. By the time Masser climbed once more above the eastern horizon, and the sky turned from lapis blue to inky black, Vera was thoroughly fed up with pointless waiting. This was it. They weren't coming back. She chose to interpret the queasy, hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach as hunger rather than loss. She used a stick to maneuver her clams and cold-baked potatoes out of the cinders. Most of the potatoes from the dinghy had either rotted or sprouted, but she found a couple that still looked and smelled edible. Either way, she'd eaten worse. Since her relocation to her new world, the chronic vitamin deficiencies she and everyone she knew had suffered from were beginning to right themselves. She'd been lucky compared to others. She had managed to keep all her teeth, at least. She scoffed down her food, counting down every chew, 10 per bite. Trying to reteach herself to eat more slowly was still a struggle. She cast her eyes towards the cliffs above. Perhaps she could climb up there and take one final look. The forewarned camp was a hike, but if nothing else, it would be an expedient way to test whether the effect of the Dunmer's smoking mixture extended to humans, as well as to gauge the distance of its efficacy. And if the camp turned out to be quiet, then that would mean that her companions were well and truly dead, or worse, and she could load up the dinghy and head out. She'd dock by Blind Cliff Cave before the rapids and cut across to Carthwaston. And from there, she might be able to hitch a ride back to Markarth if Anethak was feeling generous. Besides, she should probably bring the news of Luvinar's passing. The old alchemists had supplied the little settlement with healing potions when communication with Markarth slowed down during the winter months. The miners were probably wondering what had happened. At least don't bullshit yourself, V. You just hate leaving them behind. There's no helping it now. Should have talked them out of it when you had the chance. Why did her saner self always sound like Martha? Vera got to her feet, the adrenaline sharpening her senses. She looked at the sky. Master was already dipping behind the cliffs. She had fulfilled her part of the bargain. She was free to go. Sorry, Martha, love. Of the two of us, you were always the wiser one. She fished out the roll-up from her pocket, pinched off the burnt end, and brought the burning tip of a stick to the flaking remainder. One fast inhalation, released quickly, and then she extinguished the blunt against the sole of her boot, still wet, stuffing it back into her pocket. Hopefully, Othello would have some additional insights about the mixture. Either way, waste not. And the thought scattered. The screech, high-pitched, metallic, and entirely inhuman, sent her scrambling for her bow before her mind could classify the nature of the danger. She dove for the safety of the cliffs, boots sliding on gravel, small stones tumbling down and ricocheting off rocks, a low mounting whump like a bomb falling, and then a crash and the bassy whoosh of fire. Vera gritted her teeth against the sickly freefall of rising panic. The bow felt slippery in her palm, an arrow knocked against the rising terror. She forced herself out of her shelter through sheer force of will, her body pivoting on autopilot towards the approaching ruckus. Two lilac blobs, one bright and one faint, so close together they looked joined at the hip, were tumbling down the narrow path from the cliff top. And dotting the dark outline of the cliffs and blotting out the starlight were at least another dozen purple blobs, pulsing in perfect harmony. Vera gulped for air, suddenly in short supply. Don't think. There. One more, against Master's tawny flank, purple but tinged with red and rimmed with a necrotic darkness that brought bile to her throat. A perfect ball of flame coalesced in the center of the shimmering mass of tendrils, feeding off the purple glimmer as if it were kindling. She lined the shot, an odd, uncomfortable proposition when relying only on her peripheral vision to take aim. The honing glow vanished the second she tried to look at a target head-on, leaving only darkness in its wake. She let go of the arrow. The bowstring twanged, air whistling, and then a meaty thwack followed, another inhuman screech on its tail. Get out of here, Outlander. The Dunmer. Something grazed Vera's calf, blinding white pain, then numbness, and she stumbled back, her only thought on the dinghy. Get it moving. She hobbled to the boat, tossing her bow inside. Hurry, she screamed over her shoulder, strident, with the metallic tang of fear on her tongue. A serrated arrow bit into the skiff's hull, not a foot away from her hand. Help me get him in. She whipped around. Sero was barely recognizable. Blood and bruises and burns, one eye swollen shut to a narrow red slit. The Nord, he was half hauling, half supporting, looked like a slab of meat. Don't think. She grabbed Undnar's belt and helped the Dunmer heave his employer into the dinghy like a sack of potatoes. Push, They shoved at the hull together. A fireball flew over their heads and skittered across the dark surface, pale steam billowing in its wake. Vera grabbed the edge of the skiff. The boat wobbled, and then the current caught it, yanking her after it, the water shockingly cold even through her armor. She bit her cheek and tried to dig in her heels. Sero tumbled into the dinghy, rocking it and knocking it sideways to the current. Vera pushed again, her breaths coming in short gasps. One more push, something grabbing her by the back of her coat, and then she was dragged into the skiff. She fell in a heap next to the unresponsive Nord. "Can you steer us to safety?" Sero's voice sounded strained, edged with urgency. "Keep them off us." Vera managed through chattering teeth. She crawled to the rudder, yanking it towards her. The boat righted itself, the fast current propelling it downriver. She chanced a look at the cliffs. The purple distortions had faded. She couldn't see whether they were being pursued. On the starboard side, the Dunmer's face and hands flashed into view, flame-lit. The ball of fire, small at first, barely a flicker, then growing brighter and hotter, the core pulsing white. He grew it in increments, molding fire between his palms, like shaping a piece of dough, his battered features twisting with the effort. Vera winced. Holy hell, but they had done a number on him. He held the spell aloft, squinting into the darkness. And then, he released it. It went flying down the gorge, the rocks illuminated in time with the missile's passage. Vera didn't check to see if it hit anything. The cliffs rushed by, the river bending around the island. She glanced behind them, trying to catch that purple glow again. At least she got the answer to her question. The effect wasn't specific to mud crabs. The boat rushed on, and with each passing minute, the itchy feeling between her shoulder blades receded a little, as if the target on her back grew fainter. Maybe they would make it out of this. There would be a nasty patch of underwater boulders right around the bend, then relatively smooth sailing before the rapids. The skiff wouldn't survive those. Not with 3 people weighing it down, not to mention their gear, but if they could just... The Nord suddenly shot bolt upright and bellowed an ear-curling curse. The boat lurched to the side, taking water. Vera threw herself to the other side in counterweight, trying to right the craft, but Undnar wobbled, trying to keep his balance before collapsing in the same direction. The last thing she heard before tumbling headfirst into the river was Sero's hissed expletive. Something about Molag Bal's hairy nether regions. She hit the water with a painful jolt, the cold like a sudden vise of icy fire tightening around her lungs. Vera groped for the boat's edge, but her waterlogged armor dragged her back, her muscles shaking with the effort of staying afloat. Her feet tried to find purchase, but the river was too deep. The boat, now at the mercy of the current, rushed forward. Another fireball. Not one of Sero's, so return fire most likely, sank and fizzled inches away from her head. Vera screamed and went under. Her lungs seized, the thermal shock locking her muscles. She panicked, disoriented in the darkness, tried to kick to the surface, but her legs felt bound and unwieldy. Water rushed into her mouth and nose, the pain and sheer terror crowding out everything else. She kicked with all her force, breaching the surface and gulping a mouthful of air before being tugged under again. Her left shin slammed against an underwater rock, the agony momentarily overriding her panic, and then she was dragged over it, like laundry scraped over a washboard. Then open water again, with no sense of direction, of up and down. That's it. That's how it ends. Her vision went blurry, fading at the edges, tunneling. She must have blacked out. Awareness returned with a lurch, and the sensation of her back hitting solid ground. Vera found enough energy to roll to her side and retch into the shallow water, cramps twisting her insides in long, painful spasms. When nothing else would come out, she fell back, shaking with exhaustion, shock, and hypothermia. Above her, the Dunmer's face loomed into view. Done? He hoisted her up by the armpits and dragged her farther up the riverbank with a labored grunt. More, Vera rattled, freezing. Off. He nodded, stopped dragging, stepped over her, and busied himself with removing her gear. She tried to aid him in the process, but her fingers weren't obeying. Gone. Vera managed through chattering teeth, safe for the moment, though I have no idea where we are. The Dunmer fumbled with the laces holding her trousers in place, then tried to yank at them, but the wet knots had fused tight. He growled in frustration. Something about his expression suddenly struck Vera as utterly comical. A half-forgotten memory from her younger years, of an impatient lover brought low by the intricacies of female garments. Even then, a good brawl was already something you might draw your weapon over. She snorted, and then spluttered, water trickling from her nose and sending her down the path of uncontrollable laughter despite her raw lungs. Demon Chop stared down at her in mute condemnation, wiping at the blood trickling from his broken lip. The scab was cracked, and the wound seeped. Something amusing, Outlander? You look like... Hiccup. First time you're thwarted by... Hiccup. Snort. A woman's choice of wardrobe, Vera choked out, a great howl of laughter bursting from her chest before curdling into a cough. Next time the day concludes with you asking me to remove your clothes, I'll strive to be better prepared, he retorted dryly, though I might have enough magic left to burn them off you, if you'd rather. Bad day? Vera managed, cold and laughter and the aftershocks of terror rattling through her in equal measure. Not the worst ending to it, I suppose. He met her gaze, his expression more grimace than grin. Azura, curse it. This won't budge. You're no use to us frozen, partner, so if you have any suggestions... He cocked an eyebrow, the attempted irony somewhat spoiled by his pained wince. Try to hold still, then. You won't be much use to me cooked either. A burst of heat from his hands. Vera tried not to arch her frozen body into his palms in a misguided attempt to chase the warmth. Water sizzled, vapor billowing around them in a milky cloud. I don't suppose you can just dry the armor? The Dunmer shook his head. Not enough magic left for that. Another burst of heat. She groaned in relief as he peeled off the rest of her waterlogged leathers. The cold night air hit the soggy fabric of her undergarments, and she shivered, the tremor settling in once again. Campfire? She almost bit her tongue, trying to get the word out. I'd recommend against it. Vera growled a monosyllabic curse and hugged her knees to her chest. Yes, he runs hot. Not a good reason to crawl into his lap. Get yourself together, you dumbass. Is any of our equipment dry? What's left of it is soaked through and through, I'm afraid. What do you mean? What's left of it? Sero shrugged. Vera noticed that he had shed his armor, and the colorless linen shirt he wore looked dry. He didn't seem to suffer from the cold either. When you fell overboard, it seemed wiser to retrieve you. I sent the boat to shore as best I could by jamming the rudder. I hadn't anticipated the rocks, however. Vera tightened her arms around herself. I don't suppose you found a bow floating around, did you? This time, there was nothing ambiguous about her feeling of loss. Your weapon is by the remaining bedroll. No idea what happened to your quiver. The pack sank to the bottom, I suspect. It might be possible to recover some of our things if we wait for daylight. So I'm guessing there's no dry clothes. This was going to be a problem. Without a fire, and with the heat loss, she was unlikely to make it to sunrise. She was still clear-headed, relatively speaking, but her body felt heavy, every movement a conscious effort. You could always try that forsworn armor. I'm sure Undnar would be delighted once he wakes up. Please don't tell me that thing survived. Vera tried to discern the Dunmer's expression. Judging by the little smirk, Demon Chops was pulling her